Good morning. Continuing with our series of conferences, I am privileged to introduce to you Dr. Andrew White. Dr. Andrew White formerly was a nuclear engineer, and in actuality, he is the chief of pediatric neurology and works at the Denver Health and Children's Hospital. And today he will be speaking to us about the topic of security with 5G telecommunications. Are cell phones safe? Dr. White, we are honored to have you with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk with you. And my topic is going to be, are cell phones dangerous? And specifically, we're looking at, with the new advent of 5G, have things changed, and do we have to worry about the safety of our cell phones? Just a quick interlude here. I don't know if people remember this movie clip from Dustin Hoffman's movie. And that kind of goes along with what we see for the 5G phones. There are a lot of people that are saying it's safe, and there are a lot of people that are saying it's not safe. So the question is, what is the evidence that we have? The contents of my talk are listed on this slide. I'm going to first talk about the cell phone usage trends. We'll then talk about some of the dangers and go through kind of a brief description of what you worry about with cell phones. We'll talk about danger mitigation, then we'll talk about other real cell phone dangers, and finally we'll have some conclusions. One thing to note on, as far as 5G is concerned, or even cell phone usage, is what the pattern of cell phone usage looks like, and this is in the United States. And you notice that it actually is increasing and approaching an asymptote. The reason it isn't increasing anymore is we just don't have any more people. So the number of users just continues to go up, and we're almost to the entire population. If you look at the worldwide mobile phone users, again, you see a very large increasing trend. And each year it gets closer and closer to the population of the world. Percentage of US adults who own the following devices. For cell phones, we notice again, it's basically up to 100%, or it was in the year 2018. For smartphones, it's also climbing to that number. And the same is true in any of the other countries at this point. Some statistics that I thought would be interesting that are associated with cell phone use. Approximately 71% of the people sleep with or next to their cell phones. I personally do, because I get called on it if I'm on call. 35% of people think of their cell phones when they wake up, while only 10% of people think of their significant others. 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds have fallen asleep with their phone in their hand. I consider myself part of that group, not the 18 to 24-year-olds. 36% of people check their phones constantly, while 54% of adults are checking them constantly. Nearly 40% of people never disconnect from their cell phones, even when they're on vacation. And 44% of Americans say they couldn't go a day without their mobile devices. It is expected that we will require the support for 24 billion devices by the year 2024, which is actually 3 times the number of people in the world. So we talk about 5G. The question is, what does 5G refer to? G stands for generation, and it was created by the International Telecommunications Union, which is an agency of the United Nations. The first generation, or 1G, was created in 1979, and it was voice only. They had analog service. They had advanced mobile phone system, which was launched by the United States, but it was only limited to the United States. And the maximum speed would be 2.4 kilobits per second. That would really be, I don't know if anybody remembers, but the old modems where you dial up. It's incredibly slow compared to today's technology. 2G started in Finland in 1991. There was digital as well as analog signals. There was digital voice, there was call and text encryption, and they had SMS messaging, picture messaging, MMS, and the maximum speed increased from 2 to about 64 kilobytes per second. And it was more of a semi-global facility. You could go from one country to another. 3G, The requirements for 3G, the specifications were 200 kilobits per second as far as the peak speed. In actuality, it was much less than that. It began in 1998. There was more data. There was video calling, mobile internet, such as email, PDA, information surfing, and online shopping were available as well. The max speed there went up to 2 megabits per second, or 2 million bits per second when you were stationary. But if you were moving around, it was a little bit slower at 384 kilobits per second. There was global roaming at that point, so you could call different countries at that time. 4G, which is still what's present in most of the world, was developed in 2010, showed a peak speed of 100 megabits per second for high mobility and 1 gigabit per second for low mobility. It had easy roaming, and it really is the current standard in most places. It is able to support high definition mobile TV and some video conferencing. The max speed is tens of megabits when moving and hundreds of megabits when stationary. So it's many times faster than the 3G. Now, let's compare 2G, 3G, and 4G and 5G. As far as the facilities, again, 2G in 1991 really only provided for texting. 3G was texting and internet access. 4G was not only texting, but internet access and video as well. 5G will include texting, internet access, ultra high definition 3D video, as well as the smart home and the so-called Internet of Things. And again, we look at the frequencies that are involved in these, and they're different. And this is actually why there is so much question about 5G safety. The frequencies in 5G are much higher than those in the other, than the previous generations. Again, a slide here that shows a summary of the differences between 3G, 4G, and 5G. You can see the times when they were deployed. You see the bandwidth and the latency. Latency is important because that means how long it takes for you to actually be able to transmit and receive a signal. So if you're doing something like surgery, you don't want a 2 seconds delay between the time that you see something and you can react to it. So latency is very important, and you can see in 5G, it's less than 10 milliseconds. So that's a very big improvement over 4G. Also, again, the average speed that you get is about 10 times higher than 4G. And if you look at the actual speeds of the network, all these standard bodies set up a particular speed that they say is a goal speed. The actual speed that you get is much lower than that. If you look at the different generations here, you can see how exponentially the speed of the network has grown as we moved through time. And again, you can have 10 gigabytes or 10,000 megabytes per second with the 5G. The 5G specifications that were set up, they have to have up to 10 gigabytes per second data rate, which is a 10 to 100 times improvement over 4G, and actually there's a 4.5G also network. The latency, again, time to be able to react, is 1 millisecond. It should have 100x bandwidth per unit area, or 100 times the 4G, and up to 100 times the number of connected devices per unit area compared to the 4G LTE. The availability should be extremely high. Coverage, you want 100%. You want 90% reduction in network energy use. Why do you have a reduction in network energy use? The reason is, with 5G, you're much closer to the transmitters than you are with 4G, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The battery life is also extended on 5G transmitters because there is lower power for an Internet of Things device because they are closer to the receivers. The average 5G speeds that have been achieved as of February 2020 are listed over here in several different cities. And again, we can see that you're almost up to 1 gigabit, which is really quite a bit faster than what you get with 4G LTE, about 10 to 50 times faster than that. So again, what are the differences between 4G and 5G? The peak capacity will be up to 50 times faster in gigabytes per second. The latency, that is the time that passes from the moment information is sent from a device until it's used by the receiver, is greatly reduced, which results in faster uploads and downloads. And again, it was 20 to 30 milliseconds for 4G, and it's less than 10 milliseconds for 5G. The bandwidth size is much greater, so you can stream a lot more. You can stream a 4K video in seconds, where also 4G will support 4,000 devices, whereas 5G is supporting 1 million devices. Usually this is in a cubic or in a square kilometer. There's less interference with 5G than 4G, and it's much more efficient. Again, probably mostly because of the fact that you're closer to the transmitter. The frequency range is greater in 5G. You can go up to 300 gigahertz. And again, this is where the question of safety comes in. There have not been that many studies done as far as the safety that is going on with those higher frequency bands. The penetration for 5G is less than for 4G. If you have a 5G cell phone and you have a rainstorm, you may lose reception on the 5G portions, on the higher frequency portions of that cell phone, because it does not penetrate buildings or even rain or leaves very well. There's limited reach, as I say, with 5G. More towers are required. Certainly in the United States, every day I see more towers going up with 5G technology. You need a new tower every 100 to 200 meters, versus with 4G, you can have towers that are kilometers apart. There are lower heights for the towers. Again, they need to be closer to the receiver, but that also makes them closer to people. Transmitted power is less as distance are closer, and the batteries last longer. And again, as we said before, it supports more devices than 5G supports many more devices than 4G. Innovations in 5G. So how has 5G changed? There are several things that are different in 5G. There is duplex transmission, which means that you can transmit and receive at the same time. Again, that increases your speed of doing things. There's something called massive MIMO, which we'll see in another slide. There's beam forming. So instead of having this beam go out circumferentially, there's actually a phased array so that the beam gets pointed towards the user or towards the receiver. That again lessens the amount of exposure and radiation exposure to people who aren't the user. Because if you're, say, 180 degrees away from the user, from the transmitter, then you'll probably get very, very little radiation exposure. Again, we're looking at a millimeter wavelength in the 5G. So we're looking at much higher frequencies than what we have in 4G. And this is just really starting up. But let me just pause here for a second to say, here's a commercial talking about the capabilities of phones. So as you can see, all the different companies are really trying to get as many different functionality with their phones. I guess Crime Deterrent is one of the ones that I haven't used. If you look at the frequencies that are used for 5G, and again, this is the controversy, the high frequencies. It uses the same frequencies that 2G, 3G, and 4G have already used, plus it uses what's labeled here as supplementary spectrum, which are frequencies that are between 600 and 300, or 6 and 300 gigahertz. And those are the ones that we have little data on as far as safety is concerned. Again, this is just another cartoon saying the same thing. 5G does use many different spectrums. It uses the different spectrums for different things. For the very high frequency transfer of data. It uses small cells, and it uses the very, very high frequencies, because you can get that high frequency data transmission. We said something about massive input and output, or multiple input and output. 5G has, in one tower, has many, many inputs and many outputs. And again, has the beam forming where you direct it at a particular individual. And here's just a picture of a 5G tower. So again, capabilities of 5G. Why are we so interested in having 5G? Well, you can use a 5G Wi-Fi router instead of the broadband. You can enable remote operators of robotics because the latency is so low. As we said before, we needed that low latency. You can use it in factories, in mines, and surgery. You can also make smart cities, which are all integrated together. Autonomous vehicles can actually talk to one another and see what's going on. We talked about healthcare applications and patient monitoring as well. Drones can use this. And as we said before, there's the Internet of Things, which basically combines everything together and digitalizes everything so that we can all drive together. We can coordinate many, many different things and decrease accidents and things of that nature. Just to mention one thing that's actually coming on board right now, 6G has been proposed. And actually there is a satellite that just blasted off from China that's using 6G. And this has an even greater capability in terms of data rate and capacity. It has extreme coverage, it's extreme low energy and cost. And the latency, again, the time to reaction is very, very low, less than 1 millisecond. And it also has very high reliability and massive connectivity. So I want to switch gears now and talk now about the electromagnetic spectrum. This is, again, a schematic of what we see when we talk about radiation. Electromagnetic radiation can be from very, very low frequencies to very, very high frequencies. The low frequencies are used for submarine communication, for other things that require actually penetration into very difficult regimes. You can also see very low frequency with CRTs. Then you get to the radio frequencies, radio waves, where you have your AM, FM dial, and you've got your TV stations as well. Then you get to the area where you're in the cell phone, and that's anywhere between 3 kilohertz and 300 gigahertz is the radiation band for that. Above that, you get microwaves, infrared radiation, then visible light. Then you get to ultraviolet radiation, which can cause sunburns. Then you get to X-rays and gamma rays. The energy that is imposed on that's involved or included in the wave gets greater as the frequency gets greater and the wavelength gets smaller. So the higher the frequency, the greater the energy. If you look at the bottom part of this plot, there's non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. And that's a key point. If you go below the visible light spectrum, you are in an area where you don't ionize atoms. Where if you're above that, you can ionize atoms. If you ionize atoms, what happens is you can cause damage to chemical bonds. And that is important when you're talking about something like DNA. And again, ionizing radiation, it's a form of energy that acts by removing electrons from atoms and molecules. And non-ionizing radiation refers to any type of electromagnetic radiation that doesn't have enough energy to ionize the atoms or molecules. Examples of the different radiations: ionizing radiation would be X-rays, gamma rays, far ultraviolet are all ionizing radiations. And the far ultraviolet is some of what you see from the sun and can cause you also to have the sunburns. Non-ionizing radiation, You have near UV, ultraviolet, visible light, infrared, so thermal radiation, microwaves, and radio waves are all non-ionizing radiation, and they don't cause changes in DNA. Again, non-ionizing radiation doesn't cause changes in DNA, doesn't cause cancer directly anyway. It does warm the skin. So if you're out sunbathing and you're getting rays from the skin, even if they are non-ionizing, they can warm your skin up. It has limited penetration. It can cause skin burns and corneal damage with non-ionizing radiation. It tends to have lower penetration with higher frequencies. So it may reflect off the skin if you have relatively high frequencies. So in the case of 5G, where you have those higher frequencies, some of that radiation is actually going to bounce off your skin. And the tissue damage that can happen from radiation, mostly in this frequency range, is considered to be by thermal radiation, by heat itself. There are other causes that are postulated, and we'll look at that. A hypothetical mechanism of damage. Non-ionizing radiation can cause reactive oxidation, a reactive oxygen species. If you have enough reactive oxygen species, it can actually result in free radicals. And free radicals can actually, such as hydrogen peroxide, can damage DNA, proteins, membrane lipids, and mitochondria, which could result in cancer. So there is a hypothetical mechanism for damage that doesn't involve direct ionizing radiation. There could also be the heat can also cause an expression of heat shock proteins, denaturation, or proteolysis through direct heating. And if you have terahertz radiation, it can cause changes in DNA breathing dynamics, which can impact the DNA function. And again, we have new frequency bands that are used in 5G transmission. Those are millimeter wavelength bands. They are currently used in some other machines, in airport security devices. When you stand on the machine and they scan you, that is using millimeter wavelengths to scan you. Wi-Fi uses it, microwave ovens use it, radar uses it, cordless phones. There is actually a riot control device that uses the 5G, the new wavelengths, or the millimeter wavelengths. And there's actually been a Russian built device that looks at therapy with millimeter wavelengths. And it's been reported to help with ulcers, cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, and skin diseases and wounds. There are thermographic changes when you use your cell phone. And this is an illustration of a heat map that occurs after you've had a 15-minute phone call. You can see that there's a demonstrable increase in the temperature at the surface because of cell phone usage. One thing to note, though, is also if you're younger, this is a greater impact. And this shows that the difference between 5-year-old, 10-year-old, and adult as far as the penetration of that heat into the brain. You can also see some glucose metabolism changes. These are PET scans, and they show that the glucose metabolism is greater when you have a cell phone. So how hot can it get from the use of 5G? The statement so far is that at levels used for 5G and earlier mobile technology, the heating effects are not harmful, according to Professor Rodney Croft, who's an advisor on the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. The ICNIRP is a branch, or it's part of the World Health Organization, and therefore it basically gives guidance for the whole world. The United States actually uses more the FCC, but the ICNIRP is used for most of the world. The maximum radio frequency that someone in the community could be exposed to from 5G or any other signals in general community areas is so small that no temperature rise has been observed to date. So they're saying that it's really quite safe. One thing that actually caused a lot of consternation, a lot of worry, was this graph that was plotted, or was put in a scientific journal, that shows that the higher frequency that you're at, and here's megahertz, that the greater the absorption in brain tissue. And this is correct. If you're at higher frequency, you are going to absorb in brain tissue. But what it doesn't consider is the fact that if you're at very high frequencies, it doesn't penetrate to the brain. It doesn't get there. It stops at the skin. So if you look at this plot, look at the penetration depth in human skin at different frequencies. And you notice that it is really, if you're at a 60 or 70 gigahertz, you penetrate less than 1 millimeter. So in general, it really doesn't get very far beyond the surface of the skin. So how do we quantify radiation? We can use the power density, which is power per unit area, incident on an object, watts per square meter. So that's the power that comes directly onto the patient or onto the subject. We can also use the amount of energy that's actually absorbed by the body. So, and that's usually expressed as the watts per kilogram. So you look at the body of the person and how many watts per each kilogram is absorbed. These are known as the power density and the specific absorption rate. For the 2.3 and 4G cell phones, you worry more about the specific absorption rate because that penetrates into the body. For the 5G higher frequencies, you worry about more the power density because those are going to be deposited right at the skin. Sources of radiation include the cell tower and cell phones, and there have been investigations into each of those. I wanted to just make a note of how few studies actually there have been for the frequency that we're looking at using mostly. Those are between the 6 and 30 gigahertz frequencies that are going to be used most commonly and initially with 5G. And you can see here that there have been a total of 2 studies in that frequency range. One was a response in vivo, and the other one was a response in vitro. I want to look at actually studies that have been done with previous generations of cell phones. So the 2.3 and 4G cell phones, and just describe those briefly. There's a national toxicology program that used rats exposed to 3G radiation and showed an increased incidence of heart tumors, brain tumors, adrenal tumors, and only in males. They did study a lot of variables and they looked for a lot of different things. So it's not surprising that they would just by chance have some extra tumors. The level and duration of radiation was greater than that found in cell phone users by a factor of 4. And they also irradiated the entire body, not just the ear area where you typically have your cell phone. It's interesting because in spite of all these tumors that they saw, the irradiated rats lived longer than the controls. So maybe one could argue that 3G radiation is actually good for you. But the study was really not very informative. There have been several cell tower studies. There was a British study that compared about 1,000 families of young children with cancer against a similar group of families, children without cancer. And they didn't find any link of the mother's exposure to towers during pregnancy and the risk of any early childhood cancer. So the cell tower studies didn't show anything. There's another one with 2,600 children with cancer that were compared to a group of similar children without cancer. And if they lived in a town that could have been exposed them to a higher than average RF radiation from cellular phone towers in the previous 5 years, they had a slightly higher risk of cancer, although not of any particular type of cancer. So not a real good or positive result, but it certainly wasn't a negative result. They also noted that DNA damage was no worse in people who lived near a cell phone tower as compared to those who don't. As far as other cell phone studies, there's something called the Interphone study, compared 5,000 people who developed brain tumors, gliomas or meningiomas, and a similar group who didn't have those tumors. The study found no link between brain tumor risk and the frequency of calls, longer call time, or cell phone usage for 10 or more years. Suggested a possible increase of glioma if you're in the top 10% of people. But there's trouble with this because there's recall bias. This was not a well done study in the sense that it was looking back rather than forward. Other studies was a Danish cohort study. It compared all of the people in Denmark who had cell phone subscription to those who didn't, and to look for a possible increase in brain tumors. They actually followed the people through 2007, and they saw that cell phone use, even for more than 13 years, was not linked with an increased risk of brain tumors. There was a Million Women study, a prospective study done in 800,000 women in the UK, examined the risk of developing brain tumors over a 7-year period. And again, the study found no link. One other thing that I think is very, very telling is you look here and you look at the incidence of brain cancer and you look at the cell phone usage. The brain cancer has really not changed in spite of the fact that the cell phone usage has dramatically increased. So there isn't a clear change because of the increase in cellular phone usage. The cell phone studies are limited because you need to follow them for a long time. The variables change. There's impact on children that could be greater. It's an estimate of only usages. People's memories, they don't really remember how much they used it each day. And there also may only be a small impact. And it may be not powered well enough to determine that the impact of the cell phone. There are multiple, if you look at what the Federal Communication Commission in the United States does, as far as SAR, they have actually a value. It hasn't been updated for nearly 25 years. They developed the value in 1996, and they're using this specific absorption rate for 2, 3, and 4G. For 5G, they do use a power density. But again, nothing has changed since 1996. Okay, and I'm just going to go here. You can find actually the SAR of your phone, the specific phone that you use, by Googling it over here. There's actually the international, as we said before, the ICNIRP has a Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation, and just recently revised it. The reference is on this page on health physics, and it has a very good description of guidelines for non-ionizing radiation. I'm going to skip ahead here because of lack of time. Actually, the radiation guidelines were just changed in 2020, and they're updated periodically. And again, you can look at that reference and find out what the guidelines are. I'm going to skip through these. Basically, this is a chart saying what the summary of the guidelines. And this is what ICNIRP concluded as far as different effects. As far as brain activity, there's no evidence that it changes. Symptoms and well-being, no evidence that it changes. Basically, throughout the whole body, they found no evidence that 5G was dangerous. That doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. It means that they found no evidence. There are multiple statements by multiple organizations, including WHO, that says there is no evidence that 5G does cause cancer or long-term health effects. And FDA, NIH, FCC, IEEE, many different institutional things have said that there's no evidence. Let me just mention one other thing that is in the literature, but probably is not considered to be, or probably is more psychological than it is organic. And that's electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome. And it's rare. The symptoms can be skin, headaches, vegetative type symptoms. They did not find that it was correlated with EMF exposure, and therefore likely it is more psychological. And they say the treatment is psychological. There are many voices against 5G. Many different organizations have tried to speak up against it, including established scientists. They just say that there isn't enough evidence. There is a New York Times article that was published that said that actually Russia was trying to spread some fake news about 5G to try to inhibit the development of that in the United States. Also, there's a conspiracy theory that coronavirus is linked to 5G. There is no evidence for this. Even though they both supposedly came from China, there's no evidence that the virus is spread on radio waves or that radio waves in the 5G spectrum reduce the immune system. Please don't drink bleach or methanol to prevent the virus. Okay. There have been multiple actions taken against 5G because they don't have clear evidence that it is safe, or they don't have proof that it's safe. Methods to mitigate the risk are to use cell phones less, hold the phone away from the head, use a protective device, use a cell phone when the signal's stronger. So outside of buildings, vehicles, etc. Your phone actually will increase the power if it's low signal. Do not carry your cell phone on your body. There are, again, specific recommendations. The American Academy of Pediatrics would say use it less than 2 hours. And they recommend that kids and teenagers spend less time on the cell phone. Just to mention, I said before, there is this active denial weapon that makes your skin crawl. It makes it heat up, and it makes it very uncomfortable, and it uses these same frequencies. However, it's much higher power. Other cell phone hazards I think are actually more important than the worry about the 5G safety, such as pedestrian and auto injuries, overuse injuries, and addiction. This is a cute thing. Albert Einstein say, I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots. And then you see the kids playing with the cell phones. Cell phone and MVAs, it is very, very common to have people texting and get into accidents. And many people have distracted driving because of this. And just to notice that this is definitely increased because of distracted driving. It turns out that texting is probably the worst. You can also get head and neck injuries with cell phone use. And there are a lot of ER docs that have told me about this as well. Don't walk, talk, and text. There are actually penalties in some municipalities for this. And let me just show this commercial. Okay, there is such a thing as cell phone addiction. It's called nomophobia, the fear of not being with your phone. There are multiple warning signs similar to alcohol addiction. You can have tolerance, withdrawal, etc. Conclusion, it is unclear if non-ionizing radiation emitted from cell phones is dangerous. There's no clear evidence of harm, but unfortunately we don't have very many studies, especially for 5G and long-term uses. It is possible for people to mitigate the use. There is a clear danger from inappropriate use of cell phones, including driving and walking, and overuse injuries. And again, the absence of proof of danger is not the same as proof of absence of danger, and therefore more studies are needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. On behalf of the Medical Association of the Children's Hospital of Mexico, we greatly thank you for such a eye-opening conference on such an important area that many physicians are not fully familiar with or have as much knowledge in this area as you. And I do congratulate you for the many hats you wear. We feel honored to have you with us, and we thank you once again for your participation.
I very much appreciate the ability to participate in your conference.
Thank you, Dr. White.